Good morning, friends. We're here reading Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place, and today's chapter is chapter 11, Ravensbrook. For 2 more incredible days and 2 more nights, we were carried deeper and deeper into the land of our fears. Occasionally, one of the loaves of bread was passed from hand to hand, but not even the most elementary provision had been made for sanitation, and the air in the car was such that cold that few could eat. And gradually, more terrible than the crush of bodies and the filth, the single obsession was something to drink. 2 or 3 times when the train stopped, the door was slid open a few inches and a pail of water passed in. But we had become animals, incapable of plan or system. Those near the door got it all. At last, the morning of the 4th day, the train stopped again, and the door was opened its full width. Like infants, on hands and knees, we crawled to the opening and lowered ourselves over the side. In front of us was a smiling blue lake. On the far side, among sycamore trees, rose a white church steeple. The stronger prisoners hauled buckets of water from the lake. We drank through cracked and swollen lips. The train was shorter. The cars carrying the men had disappeared. Only a handful of soldiers, some of them looking no older than 15, were there to guard 1,000 women. No more were needed. We could scarcely walk, let alone resist. After a while, they got us into straggly columns and marched us off. For a mile, the road followed the shore of the lake, then left it to climb a hill. I wondered if Betsie could make it to the top, but the sight of trees and sky seemed to have revived her, and she supported me as much as I her. We passed a number of local people on foot and in horse-drawn wagons. The children especially seemed wonderful to me, pink-cheeked and healthy. They returned my stares with wide-eyed interest. I noticed, however, that the adults did not look at us but turned their heads away as we approached. From the crest of the hill we saw it, like a vast scar on the green German landscape. A city of low gray barracks surrounded by concrete walls on which guard towers rose at intervals. In the very center, a square smokestack emitted a thin gray vapor into the blue sky. Ravensbrook. Like a whispered curse, the word passed back through the lines. This was the notorious women's extermination camp, whose name we had heard even in Harlem. That squat concrete building, that smoke disappearing in the bright sunlight. No, I would not look at it. As Betsie and I stumbled down the hill, I felt the Bible bumping between my shoulder blades. God's good news. Was it to this world that he had spoken it? Now we were close enough to see the skull and crossbones posted at intervals on the walls to warn of electrified wiring along the top. The massive iron gates swung in. We marched between them. Acres of soot-gray barracks stretched ahead of us. Just inside the wall was a row of waist-high water spigots. We charged them, thrusting our hands, arms, legs, even heads under the streams of water, washing away the stench of boxcars. A squad of women guards in dark blue uniforms rushed at us, hauling and shouting, swinging their short, hard crops. At last they drove us back from the faucets and herded us down an avenue between barracks. This camp appeared far grimmer than the one we had left. At least, in marches about Butte, we had caught sight of fields and woods. Here every vista ended in the same concrete barrier. The camp was set down in a vast man-made valley, rising on every side to those towering wire-topped walls. At last we halted. In front of us, a vast canvas, tent roofs, no sides, covered an acre or more of straw-strewn ground. Betsie and I found a spot on the edge of this area and sank gratefully down. Instantly we were on our feet again. Lice. The straw was literally alive with them. We stood for a while, clutching blankets and pillowcases well away from the infested ground. But at last we spread our blankets over the squirming straw and sat on them. Some of the prisoners had brought scissors from Butte. Everywhere beneath the huge tent, women were cutting one another's hair. A pair was passed to us. Of course, we must do the same. Long hair was folly in such a place. But as I cut Betsie's chestnut waves, I cried. Toward evening, there was a commotion at one end of the tent. A line of SS guards was moving across it, driving women out from under the canvas. We scrambled to our feet, snatched up our blankets as they bore down upon us. Perhaps 100 yards beyond the tent, the chase stopped. We stood about uncertain what to do. Whether a new group of prisoners had arrived or what the reason was for driving us from the tent, no one knew. Women began spreading their blankets on the hard cinder ground. Slowly it dawned on me, Betsie and me, that we were to spend the night on the ground. We laid my blanket on the ground, stretched out side by side, and pulled hers over us. The night is dark, and I am far from home. Betsie's sweet soprano was picked up by voices all around us. Lead thou on me. Lead thou me on. We were waked up sometime in the middle of the night by a clap of thunder and a deluge of rain. The blankets soaked through, and water gathered in puddles beneath us. In the morning the field was a vast, sodden swamp. Hands, clothes, and faces were black from the cinder mud. We were still wringing water from our blankets when the command came to line up for coffee. It was not coffee, but a thin liquid of approximately the same color, and we were grateful to get it as we shuffled double file past the makeshift filled kitchen. There was a slice of black bread for each prisoner, too, then nothing more until we were given a ladle of turnip soup and a small boiled potato late in the afternoon. In between, we were kept standing at rigid attention on the soggy parade ground where we had spent the night. We were near one edge of the huge camp here, close enough to the outer wall to see the triple row of electric wires running along the top. 2 entire days we spent this way, stretching out again, the second night right where we stood. It did not rain again, but ground and blankets were still damp. Betsie began to cough. I took Nolly's blue sweater from my pillowcase, wrapped it around her, and gave her a few drops of the vitamin oil. But by the morning she had agonized intestinal cramps. Again and again, throughout that second day, she had to ask the impatient woman monitor at the head of our row for permission to go to the ditch that served as sanitary facility. It was the third night as we were getting ready to lie down again under the sky when the order came to report to the processing center for new arrivals. A 10-minute march brought us to the building. We inched along a corridor into a huge reception room, and there, under the harsh ceiling lights, we saw a dismal sight. As each woman reached a desk where some officers sat, she had to lay her blanket, pillowcase, and whatever else she carried onto a growing pile of these things. A few desks further along, she had to strip off every scrap of clothes, throw them into a second pile, and walk naked, past the scrutiny of a dozen SS men, into the shower room. Coming out of the shower, she wore only a thin prison dress and a pair of shoes, nothing more. But Betsie needed that sweater. She needed the vitamins. Most of all, we needed our Bible. How could we live in this place without it? But how could I ever take it past so many watchful eyes without the overalls covering it? We were almost at the first desk. I fished desperately in my pillowcase, drew out the bottle of vitamins, and closed my fist around them. Reluctantly, we dropped the other things onto the heap that was fast becoming a mountain. Dear God, I prayed, you have given us this precious book. You have kept it hidden through the checkpoints and inspections. You've used it for so many. I felt Betsie stagger against me and looked at her in alarm. Her face was white, her lips pressed tight together. A guard was passing by. I begged him in German to show us the toilets. Without so much as a glance, he jerked his head in the direction of the shower room. Timidly, Betsie and I stepped out of line and walked to the door of the big, dank-smelling room with its row on row of overhead spigots. It was empty, waiting for the next batch of filthy, naked, and shivering women to be admitted. Please, I said to the SS man guarding the door, where are the toilets? He did not look at me either. Use the drain holes, he snapped, and we stepped inside. As we stepped inside, he slammed the door behind us. We stood alone in the room where a few minutes later we would return, stripped even of the clothes on our backs. Here were the prison things we were to put on, piled just inside the door. From the back of each otherwise ordinary dress, a large X had been cut out and replaced with cloth of another color. And then we saw something else. Stacked in the far corner, a pile of old wooden benches. They were slimy with mildew, crawling with cockroaches, but to me they seemed the furniture of heaven itself. The sweater. Take the sweater off, I hissed. Fumbling with the string around at my neck, Betsie handed it to me, and in an instant I had wrapped it around the Bible and the vitamin bottle and stuffed the precious bundle behind the benches. And so it was that when we were herded into that room 10 minutes later, we were not poor, but rich. Rich in this new evidence of him, of the care of him who was God, even of Ravensbrook. We stood beneath the spigots as long as the flow of icy water lasted, feeling it soften our lice-eaten skin. Then we clustered, dripping wet, around the heap of prison dresses, holding them up, passing them out, looking for appropriate fits. I found a loose, long-sleeved dress for Betsie that would cover the blue sweater when she would have a chance to put it on. I squirmed into another dress for myself, then reached behind the benches and shoved the little bundle quickly inside the neck. It made a bulge you could have seen across the Grot Market. I flattened it out as best I could, pushed it down, tugging the sweater around my waist, but there was no real concealing it beneath the thin cotton dress. And all the while I had the incredible feeling that it didn't matter, that this was not my business but God's, that all I had to do was walk straight ahead. As we trooped back out through the shower room door, the SS men ran their hands over every prisoner, front, back, and sides. The woman ahead of me was searched 3 times. Behind me, Betsie was searched. No hand touched me. At the exit door to the building was a second ordeal, a line of women guards examining each prisoner again. I slowed down as I reached them, but the Officerin in charge shoved me roughly by the shoulder. "Move along, you're holding up the line." And so Betsie and I arrived at Barracks 8 in the small hours of that morning, bringing not only the Bible, but a new knowledge of the power of him whose story it was. There were 3 women already asleep in the bed assigned to us. They made room for us as best they could, but the mattress sloped, and I kept sliding to the floor. At last all 5 of us lay sideways across the bed and managed to get shoulders and elbows arranged. The blanket was a poor threadbare affair compared with the ones we had given up, but at least the overcrowding produced its own warmth. Betsie had put on the blue sweater beneath her long-sleeved dress, and wedged now between me and the others, her shivering gradually subsided, and she was asleep. I lay awake a while longer, watching a searchlight sweep the rear wall in long, regular arcs, hearing the distant calls of soldiers patrolling the walls. Morning roll call at Ravensbrook came half an hour earlier than at Butte. By 4:30 a.m., we had to be standing outside in the black pre-dawn chill, standing at parade attention in blocks of 100 women, 10 wide, 10 deep. Sometimes after hours of this, we would gain the shelter of the barracks only to hear the whistle. "Everybody out! Fall in for roll call!" Barracks 8 was in the quarantine compound. Next to us, perhaps as a deliberate warning to newcomers, were located the punishment barracks. From there all day long and often into the night came the sounds of hell itself. They were not the sounds of anger or of any human emotion, but of a cruelty altogether detached, blows landing in regular rhythm, screams keeping pace. We would stand in our 10-deep ranks with our hands trembling at our sides, longing to jam them against our ears to make the sounds stop. The instant of dismissal, we would mob the door of Barracks 8, stepping on each other's heels in our eagerness to get inside, to shrink the world back to understandable proportions. It grew harder and harder. Even within these 4 walls, there was too much misery, too much seemingly pointless suffering. Every day something else failed to make sense. Something else grew too heavy. Will you carry this too, Lord Jesus? But as the rest of the world grew stranger, one thing became increasingly clear, and that was that reason the 2 of us were here. Why others should suffer, we were not shown. As for us, the morning until lights out, whenever we were not in ranks for roll call, our Bible was the center of an ever-widening circle of help and hope. Like waifs clustered around a blazing fire, we gathered about it, holding out our hearts to its warmth and light. The blacker the night around us grew, the brighter and truer and more beautiful burned the word of God. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. I would look about us as Betsie read, watching the light leap from face to face. More than conquerors. It was not a wish, it was a fact. We knew it. We experienced it minute by minute. Poor, hated, hungry. We are more than conquerors. Not we shall be. We are. Life in Ravensbrook took place on two separate levels, mutually impossible. One, the observable, external life, grew every day more horrible. The other, the life we lived with God, grew daily better. Truth upon truth, glory upon glory. Sometimes I would slip the Bible from its little sack with hands that shook, so mysterious had it become to me. It was new. It had just been written. I marveled sometimes that the ink was dry. I had believed the Bible always, but reading it now had nothing to do with belief. It was simply a description of the way things were, of hell and heaven, of how men act and how God acts. I'd read 1,000 times the story of Jesus' arrest, how soldiers had slapped him, laughed at him, flogged him. Now such happenings had faces and voices. Fridays, the recurrent humiliation of medical inspection. The hospital corridor in which we waited was unheated, and a fall chill had settled into the walls. Still, we were forbidden even to wrap ourselves in our arms, but had to maintain our erect, hands at sides position as we filed slowly past a phalanx of grinning guards. How there could have been any pleasure in the sight of these stick-thin legs and hunger-gloated stomachs, I could not imagine. Surely there is no more wretched sight than the human body unloved and uncared for. Nor could I see the necessity for the complete undressing. When we finally reached the examining room, a doctor looked down each throat, another, a dentist presumably, at our teeth, a third in between each finger. That was all. We trooped again down the long, cold corridor and picked up our X-marked dresses at the door. But it was one of these mornings while we were waiting, shivering in the corridor, that yet another page in the Bible leapt into life for me. He hung naked on the cross. I had not known, I had not thought. The paintings, the carved crucifixes showed at the least a scrap of cloth, but this I suddenly knew was the respect and reverence of the artist. But oh, at the time itself, on that other Friday morning, there had been no reverence. No more than I saw in the faces around us now. I leaned toward Betsie ahead of me in line. Her shoulder blades stood out sharp and thin beneath her blue mottled skin. Betsie, they took his clothes too. Ahead of me I heard a little gasp. Oh, Corey, and I never thanked him. Every day the sun rose a little later. The bite took longer to leave the air. It will be better, everyone assured everyone else, when we move into permanent barracks. We'll have a blanket apiece, a bed of our own. Each of us painted into the picture her own greatest need. For me, it was a dispensary where Betsie could get medication for her cough. There'll be a nurse assigned to the barracks. I said it so often that I convinced myself. I was doing out a drop of the divitamin each morning on her piece of black bread. How much longer could the small bottle last? Especially, I would tell her, if you keep sharing it around every time someone sneezes. The move to permanent quarters came the second week in October. We were marched 10 abreast along a wide cinder avenue and then in a narrower street of barracks. Several times the column halted while numbers were read out. Names were never used at Ravensbrook. At least Betsie and mine were called. Prisoner 66729. Prisoner 66730. We stepped out of line with a dozen or so others and stared at the long gray front of Barracks 28. Half its windows seemed to have been broken and replaced with rags. A door in the center led us into a large room where 200 or more women bent over knitting needles. On tables between them were piles of woolen socks in army gray. On either side, doors opened into two still larger rooms, by far the largest dormitories we had yet seen. Betsie and I followed a prisoner guide through the door at the right. Because of the broken windows, the vast room was in semi-twilight. Our noses told us first that the place was filthy. Somewhere plumbing had backed up. The bedding was soiled and rancid. Then, as our eyes adjusted to the gloom, we saw that there were no individual beds at all, but great square piers stacked 3 high and wedged side by side, end to end, with only an occasional narrow aisle slicing through. We followed our guide single file. The aisle was not wide enough for 2. Fighting back the claustrophobia of these platforms rising everywhere above us, the tremendous room was nearly empty of people. They must have been out on various work crews. At last she pointed to a second tier in the center of a large block. To reach it, we had to stand on the bottom level, haul ourselves up, and then crawl across 3 other straw-covered platforms to reach the one that we would share with how many? The deck above us was too close to let us sit up. We lay back, struggling against the nausea that swept over us from the reeking straw. We could hear the women who had arrived with us finding their places. Suddenly I sat up, striking my head on the cross slats above. Something had pinched my leg. "Fleas!" I cried. "Betsie, this place is swarming with them." We scrambled across the intervening platforms, heads low to avoid another bump, dropped down the aisle and edged our way to a patch of light. "Here, and here another one," I wailed. "Betsie, how can we live in such a place?" Show us how." It was said so matter-of-factly, it took me a second to realize she was praying. More and more, the distinction between prayer and the rest of life seemed to be vanishing for Betsie. "Corey," she said excitedly, "he's given us the answer." Before we asked, as he always does, "In the Bible this morning." "Where was it? Read that part again." I glanced down the long, dim aisle to make sure no guard was in sight, then drew the Bible from its pouch. "It was in 1 Thessalonians," I said. We were on our 3rd complete reading of the New Testament since leaving Scheveningen. In the feeble light, I turned to the pages. Here it is. "Comfort the frightened, help the weak, be patient with everyone. See that none of you repays evil for evil, but always seeks to do good to one another and to all." It seemed written expressly to Ravensbrook. "Go on," said Betsie. "That wasn't all." "Oh yes. To one another and to all, rejoice always, pray constantly, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Jesus Christ." That's it, Corey. That's his answer. Give thanks in all circumstances. That's what we can do. We can start right now to thank God for every single thing about this new barracks. I stared at her, then around at me, at the dark, foul-aired room. "Such as," I said, "such as being assigned here together." I bit my lip. "Oh yes, Lord Jesus." "Such as what you're holding in your hands?" I looked down at the Bible. "Yes. Thank you, dear Lord, that there was no inspection when we entered here. Thank you for all the women here in this room who will meet you in these pages." "Yes," said Betsie. "Thank you for the very crowding here. Since we're packed so close, that many more will hear." She looked at me expectantly. "Corey," she prodded. "Oh, all right. Thank you for the jammed, crammed, stuffed, packed, suffocating crowds." "Thank you," Betsie went on serenely, "for the fleas and for..." "The fleas?" This was too much. "Betsie, there's no way even God can make me grateful for a flea." "Give thanks in all circumstances," she quoted. "It doesn't say in pleasant circumstances. Fleas are part of this place where God has put us." And so we stood between piers of bunks and gave thanks for fleas. But this time I was sure Betsie was wrong. They started arriving soon after 6 o'clock, the women of Barracks 28, tired, sweat-stained, and dirty from the long forced labor details. The building, we learned from one of our platform mates, had been designed to hold 400. There were now 1,400 quartered here, with more arriving weekly as concentration camps in Poland, France, Belgium, Austria, as well as Holland were evacuated toward the center of Germany. There were 9 of us sharing our particular square designed for 4, and some grumbling as the others discovered they would have to make room for Betsie and me. 8 acrid and overflowing toilets served the entire room. To reach them, we had to crawl not only over our own bedmates, but over those on the other platforms between us and the closest aisle, always as at the risk of adding too much weight to the already sagging slats and crashing down on the people beneath. It happened several times that first night. From somewhere in the room would come a splintering sound, a shriek, smothered cries. Even when the slats held, the least movement on the upper platform sent a shower of dust and straw over the sleepers below, followed by a volley of curses. In Barracks 8, most of us had been Dutch. Here there was not even a common language, and among exhausted, ill-fed people, quarrels erupted constantly. There was one raging now as the women sleeping nearest the windows slammed them shut against the cold. At once, scores of voices demanded that they be raised again. Brawls were starting up and down that side of the room. We heard scufflings, slaps, sobs. In the dark, I felt Betsie's hand clasp mine. "Lord Jesus," she said aloud, "send your peace into this room. There has been too little praying here. The very walls know it. But where you come, Lord, the spirits of strife cannot exist." The change was gradual but distinct. One by one, the angry sounds led up. "I'll make you a deal." The voice spoke German with a strong Scandinavian accent. "You can sleep in where it's warmer, and I'll take your place by the window. And add your lice to my own." But there was a chuckle in the answer. "No thanks." "I'll tell you what," the third voice said in a French burr. "We'll open them halfway. That way we'll be only half frozen, and you'll be only half smothered." A ripple of laughter widened around the room at this. I lay back on the sour straw and knew there was one more circumstance for which I could give thanks Betsie had come to Barracks 28. Roll call came at 4:40 a.m. Here as it had in quarantine. A whistle roused us at 4 when, without even shaking the straw from clothes and hairs, the stampede began for the ration of bread and coffee in the center room. Last comers found none. The count was made in the Lagerstrasse, the wide avenue leading to the hospital. There we joined the occupants of other barracks, some 35,000 at that time, stretching out of sight in the pale glow of the street lamps, feet growing numb on the cold cinder ground. After roll call, work crews were called out. For weeks, Betsie and I were assigned to the Simmons factory. This huge complex of mills and railroad terminals was a mile and a half from the camp. The Simmons Brigade, several thousand of us, marched out the iron gate beneath the charged wires into a world of trees and grass and horizons. The sun rose as we skirted the little lake. The gold of the late fall fields lifted our heart. The work at Simmons, however, was sheer misery. Betsie and I had to push a heavy hand cart to a railroad siding where we unloaded large metal plates from a boxcar and wheeled them to a receiving gate at the factory. The grueling workday lasted 11 hours. At least at noontime we were given a boiled potato and some thin soup. Those who worked inside the camp had no midday meal. Returning to camp, we could barely lift our swollen and aching legs. The soldiers patrolling us bellowed and cursed, but we could only shuffle forward inches at a step. I noticed again how the local people turned their eyes another way. Back at the barracks, we formed yet another line. Would there never be an end to the columns and weights? To receive our ladle of turnip soup in the center room. Then, as quickly as we could for the press of people, Betsie and I made our way to the rear of the dormitory room where we held our worship service. Around our own platform area there was not enough light to read the Bible, but back here a small light bulb cast a wan yellow circle on the wall, and here an ever larger group of women gathered. They were services like no others. These times in Barracks 28, a single meeting night might include a recital of the Magnificat in Latin by a group of Roman Catholics, a whispered hymn by some Lutherans, a sotto voce chant by Eastern Orthodox women. With each moment, the crowd around us would swell, packing the nearby platforms hanging over the edges until the high structures groaned and swayed. At last, either Betsie or I would open the Bible, because only the Hollanders could understand the Dutch text we could translate aloud in German. And then we would hear the life-giving words passed back along the aisles in French, Polish, Russian, Czech, back into Dutch. They were little previews of heaven. Those evenings beneath the light bulb, I would think of Harlem, each substantial church set behind its wrought iron fences and its barrier of doctrine, and I would know again that in darkness God's truth shines most clear. At first Betsie and I called these meetings with great timidity, but as night after night went by and no guard ever came near us, we grew bolder. So many now wanted to join us that we held a second service after evening roll call. There on the Lagerstraat, we were under rigid surveillance. Guards in their warm wool capes marched constantly up and down. It was the same in the center room of the barracks. Half a dozen guards or camp police always present, yet in the large dormitory room there was almost no supervision at all. We did not understand it. Another strange thing was happening. The Dividement bottle was continuing to produce drops. It scarcely seemed possible, so small a bottle, so many doses a day. Now, in addition to Betsie, a dozen others on our pier were taking it. My instinct was always to hoard it. Betsie was growing so very weak, but the others were ill as well. It was hard to say no to eyes that burned with fever, hands that shook with chill. I tried to save it for the very weakest, but even these soon numbered 15, 20, 25. And still every time I tilted the little bottle, a drop appeared on the tip of the glass dropper. It just couldn't be. I held it up to the light, trying to see how much was left, but the dark brown glass was too thick to see through. There was a woman in the Bible, Betsie said, whose oil jar was never empty. She turned to it in the Book of Kings, the story of the poor widow of Zarephath, who gave Elijah a room in her home. The jar of meal not wasted not, neither did the cruse of oil fail according to the word of Jehovah which he spoke by Elijah. Well, but wonderful things happened all through the Bible. It was one thing to believe that such things were possible thousands of years ago, another to have it happen now to us this very day. And yet it happened this day, and the next, and the next, until an odd little group of spectators stood around watching the drops fall onto the daily rations of bread. Many nights I lay awake in the shower of straw dust from the mattress above, trying to fathom the marvel of supply lavished upon us. Maybe, I whispered to Betsie, only a molecule or two really gets through the little pinhole, and then in the air it expands. I heard her soft laughter in the dark. Don't try too hard to explain it, Corey. Just accept it as a surprise from a father who loves you. And then one day, Mian pushed her way to us in the evening food line. Look what I've got for you. Mian was a pretty young Dutch woman we had met in Butte. She was assigned to the hospital and often managed to bring to Barracks 28 some stolen treasure from the staff room. A sheet of newspaper to stuff in a broken window, a slice of bread left untouched on a nurse's plate. Now we peered into the small cloth sack she carried. Vitamins, I cried, and then cast an apprehensive glance at the camp policeman nearby. Yeast compound, I whispered. Yes, she hissed back. There were several huge jars. I emptied each just the same amount. We gulped the thin turnip water, marveled at our sudden riches. Back at the bunk, I took the bottle from the straw. We'll finish the drops first, I decided. But that night, no matter how long I held it upside down, or how hard I shook it, not another drop appeared. On the 1st of November, a coat was issued to each prisoner. Betsie and mine were both of Russian make, probably once trimmed with fur. Thread showed where something had been torn from the collars and cuffs. Call-ups for the Simmons factory had ceased, and we speculated that it had been hit in one of the bombing raids that came within earshot almost nightly now. Betsie and I were put to work leveling some rough ground just inside the camp wall. This too was back-breaking labor. Sometimes, as I bent to lift a load, my heart cramped strangely. At night, spasms of pain gripped my legs. But the biggest problem was Betsie's strength. One morning, after a hard night's rain, we arrived to find the ground sodden and heavy. Betsie had never been able to lift much. Today, her shovelfuls were microscopic, as she stumbled frequently, and she walked to the low ground where she dumped the loads. Schneller, a guard screamed at her. Can't you go faster? Why must they scream, I wondered, as I sank my shovel into the black muck. Why couldn't they speak like ordinary human beings? I straightened slowly, the sweat drying on my back. I was remembering where we had first heard this maniac sound, the Behe, in Tante Jan's rooms, a voice coming from the shell-shaped speaker, a scream lingering in the air even after Betsie had leapt to shut it off. "Loafer! Lazy swine!" The guard snatched Betsie's shovel from her hands and ran from group to group of the digging crew, exhibiting the handful of dirt that was all Betsie had been able to lift. "Look what Madame Baroness is carrying. Surely she will overexert herself." The other guards and even some of the prisoners laughed. Encouraged, the guard threw herself into a parody of Betsie's faltering walk. A male guard was with our detail today, and in the presence of a man, the women guards were always animated. As the laughter grew, I felt a murderous anger rise. The guard was young and well-fed. Was it Betsie's fault that she was old and starving? But to my astonishment, Betsie too was laughing. "That's me, all right," she admitted, "but you'd better let me totter along with my little spoonful, or I'll have to stop altogether." The guard's plump cheeks went crimson. "I'll decide who's to stop!" And snatching the leather crop from her belt, she slashed Betsie across the chest and neck. Without knowing I was doing it, I had seized my shovel and rushed at her. Betsie stopped in front of me before anyone had seen. "Corey," she pleaded, dragging my arm to my side. "Corey, keep working." She tugged the shovel from my hand and dug it into the mud. Contemptuously, the guard tossed Betsie's shovel toward us. I picked it up, still in a daze. A red stain appeared on Betsie's collar. A welt began to swell on her neck. Betsie saw where I was looking and laid a bird-thin hand over the whip mark. "Don't look at it, Corey. Look at Jesus only." She drew away her hand. It was sticky with blood. In mid-November, the rains started in earnest chill, drenching day-long downpours that left beads of moisture even on the inside walls. The Lagerstrasse was never dry now, even when the rain let up. Deep puddles stood in the road. We were not allowed to step around them as the ranks were formed. Often we stood in water up to our ankles, and at night the barracks reeked with rotting shoe leather. Betsie's cough began to bring up blood. We went to sick call at the hospital, but the thermometer registered only 102 degrees, not enough to admit her to the wards. Alas for my fantasies of a nurse and a dispensary in each barracks. This large, bare room in the hospital was where all the sick in the camp had to assemble, often standing outside in the rain for hours just to get through the door. I hated the dismal place full of sick and suffering women. We had to go back again and again, for Betsie's condition was growing worse. She was not repelled by the room as I was. To her it was simply a setting in which to talk about Jesus, as indeed was every place else. Wherever she was, at work, in the food line, in the dormitory, Betsie spoke to those around her about his nearness and his yearning to come into their lives. As her body grew weaker, her faith seemed to grow bolder. And sick call was such an important place, Corey. Some of these people are at the threshold of heaven. At last, one night, Betsie's fever registered over the required 104 degrees. There was another long wait until a nurse appeared to lead her and half a dozen others into the hospital proper. I stayed with them as far as the door to the ward, then made my way slowly back to the barracks. As usual, I stood in the door of the dormitory. It reminded me most of an anthill. Some women were already asleep after the long workday, but most were stirring about, some waiting for a turn at the toilets, others picking lice off themselves and their neighbors. I twisted and squirmed through the crowded aisles to the rear where the prayer service was just ending. Nights when Betsie and I reported to sick call, we left the Bible with Mrs. Wheelmaker, a saintly Roman Catholic woman from The Hague who could render the Dutch words in German, French, Latin, or Greek. Women crowded round me, asking after Betsie. How was she? How long would she have to stay? Lights out, blew, and the scramble into the bunks began. I hoisted myself on the middle tier and crawled across those already in place. What a difference since Betsie had come to this room. Where before this had been a moment for scuffles and cursing, tonight the huge dormitory buzzed with "sorry," "excuse me," and "no harm done." I found our section in the dark and squeezed into the spot in the middle. From the doorway, a searchlight swept the room, lingering on blocks where anything stirred. Someone's elbow dug into my back. Another woman's feet were 2 inches from my face. How was it possible, packed so close, to be so utterly and miserably alone?